Picture this. November 2019, and there's this couple dancing barefoot on a Hawaiian beach in Kauai, their toes sinking into warm sand as turquoise waves crash gently behind them. They're newlyweds, absolutely giddy with that honeymoon energy, taking selfies and laughing like they don't have a single care in the world. Lori Vallow Daybell, blonde and radiant in her flowing beach wedding dress, is wrapped in the arms of her new husband, Chad Daybell, a middle-aged man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses who honestly looks more like a small-town librarian than any kind of prophet. They're staying in a gated community in Princeville, living off life insurance money, soaking up paradise. To anyone watching them stroll along the shore hand in hand, or attend a local church service on Sunday, they look like any other middle-aged couple starting their second chance at love and happiness together. But here's the thing that makes your stomach turn, the thing that transforms this seemingly innocent scene into something absolutely nightmarish. While Lori and Chad are posing for wedding photos on the beach and enjoying tropical drinks with little umbrellas in them, two children are missing. 7-year-old Joshua Jackson Vallow, who everyone called JJ, a special needs boy with the biggest smile, and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, a protective big sister who loved photography, haven't been seen in months. Nobody knows where they are, and it's not just the children who have disappeared from the picture. Lori's fourth husband, Charles Vallow, was shot dead in her Arizona home just 4 months earlier in July. Chad's wife of nearly 30 years, Tammy Daybell, died under what police would later call highly suspicious circumstances just 2 weeks before this beach wedding ceremony. Two spouses dead within months of each other, two children vanished without a trace, and here are Lori and Chad acting like they're living their absolute best lives in tropical paradise, posting photos, attending church, playing house in their rented condo. Back on the mainland in Idaho and Arizona, family members are absolutely frantic, making desperate phone calls, filing police reports, begging for answers. Kay and Larry Woodcock, JJ's biological grandparents, haven't heard their grandson's voice in months. They've been calling Lori's phone over and over, texting, sending messages on social media, begging for just one photo, one quick video chat, one phone call, anything at all to prove JJ is okay and safe. Kay is Charles Vallow's sister, and she had watched her brother raise this beautiful special needs boy with so much patience and unconditional love. Now Charles is dead, buried in a grave, and JJ has completely disappeared, and Lori won't answer a single question. She won't return calls, she won't respond to texts, she won't provide any proof of life. When Kay finally convinced police to do a welfare check on November 26, 2019, officers showed up at Lori's townhouse in Rexburg, Idaho, searching for the children. But they found no kids, no toys, no evidence that any children lived there at all. Lori lied straight to the officers' faces, claiming with this perfectly calm demeanor that JJ was in Arizona staying with a family friend named Melanie Gibb. When police immediately contacted Melanie Gibb to verify Lori's story, Gibb told them that was completely false, that JJ hadn't been with her in months, not since September. The next day, when officers returned to Lori's townhouse to question her further and demand real answers about where these children actually were, she was gone, just vanished. The townhouse was cleared out. And that's when investigators realized with growing horror that Tylee, who should have been starting her junior year of high school, taking driver's ed, going to football games, was also missing. Nobody had seen or heard from her since early September either. This is where our story really begins, in that sickening gap between what appears to be true and what actually is. Because Lori Vallow Daybell wasn't just some overwhelmed mother who temporarily lost track of her kids or made some questionable parenting decisions. She wasn't a woman who accidentally got caught up in something beyond her control. The evidence that prosecutors would eventually present at trial showed that Lori, working together with Chad Daybell and her brother Alex Cox, had orchestrated a calculated series of murders rooted in twisted extremist religious beliefs that convinced them certain people were possessed by demons and needed to die. They genuinely believed in zombies, not the Hollywood kind, but the idea that living people could become possessed by dark spirits. They believed in rating people on a scale of light versus dark spiritual energy. They believed in an apocalypse that would wipe out most of humanity in July 2020, while they would emerge as leaders of the survivors. And anyone who stood in the way of their supposed divine mission, anyone they personally rated as dark, on their homemade scale of good versus evil, became completely expendable in their minds, including two innocent children who had done nothing wrong except be born to the wrong mother. Before she became internationally known as the Doomsday Mom, before her mugshot was plastered across every news channel and true crime podcast, Lori was just another woman trying to navigate the complicated terrain of life, love, marriage, and motherhood. Born Lori Norn Cox on June 26, 1973, in San Bernardino, California, she grew up in a Mormon family that moved around quite a bit during her childhood. Her parents, Barry and Janice Cox, were tax protesters who adhered to sovereign citizen ideology, constantly engaged in conflicts with the IRS for about 2 decades over their refusal to pay federal income taxes. But that's honestly a whole different complicated story for another time. Lori was a genuinely beautiful woman, the kind who naturally turned heads when she walked into any room. She had been a contestant in the Mrs. Texas beauty pageant at one point, competing in the gown and interview portions, and she even appeared as a contestant on the game show Wheel of Fortune back in 2004, spinning that giant colorful wheel and guessing letters. She worked as a hairdresser for a time in various salons, cutting and styling hair, building what looked from the outside like a pretty normal middle-class American life. But Lori's romantic history was complicated from the very beginning, marked by a string of marriages that each seemed to end badly, sometimes explosively. Her first marriage was to a man named Nelson Yanes in 1992, when Lori was just 19 years old, barely out of her teenage years. That marriage didn't last long at all, ending in divorce relatively quickly, though not much detailed information is publicly available about Nelson or what went wrong in that first marriage. Then in October 1995, Lori married her second husband, William Lagioia. Court documents from that time period paint a picture of a troubled relationship almost from the start. There was an assault incident documented in July 1995, just a few months before they actually got married, which should probably have been a massive red flag for everyone involved. Their son Colby Ryan was born in April 1996. The marriage deteriorated rapidly, and by December 1996, barely a year after the wedding, Lori had already filed for divorce. The divorce was finalized on February 25, 1998. Then in 2001, Lori married Joseph Anthony Ryan Jr., her third husband. Joseph adopted Colby, giving him the Ryan last name that he still uses today. Their daughter, Tylee Ryan, was born on September 1, 2002. From the outside, maybe it looked like Lori had finally found some stability, finally had the family she wanted. But this marriage turned absolutely toxic. Lori and Joseph divorced in 2004, and what followed was an incredibly bitter, drawn-out custody battle where serious accusations flew back and forth. Lori accused Joseph of sexually assaulting both children. Joseph fought for custody. The court battles went on for years. Joseph eventually lost equal custody rights. Years later, as an adult, Colby Ryan would confirm publicly during interviews that he had been sexually abused by Joseph Ryan when he was a child, lending credibility to Lori's original accusations. But the drama with Joseph didn't end when the divorce was finalized. In 2007, Lori's brother Alex Cox physically attacked Joseph Ryan, beating him up and claiming he had been abusive toward Lori and the children. Alex ended up serving 90 days in jail for that assault, but looking back now, That incident established a pattern that would become absolutely chillingly relevant years later. Alex Cox was Lori's enforcer, her protector, her big brother who would use physical violence on her behalf without hesitation. When Lori had a problem with someone, Alex would handle it. In 2018, Joseph Ryan was found dead in his apartment in Arizona from what was officially determined to be arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, basically a heart attack caused by hardened arteries. He was only 59 years old. At the time, nobody suspected anything sinister or criminal about his death. It seemed natural, unfortunate, but not suspicious. But after Lori's arrest in 2020, police went back and reviewed Joseph Ryan's death with fresh eyes after a recording surfaced where Lori mentioned wanting to kill Joseph, like Nephi killed. Nephi is a figure from the Book of Mormon who killed a man named Laban because God commanded him to do it. Despite reopening the investigation, investigators ultimately found nothing concrete to suspect foul play in Joseph's death, and the FBI closed that particular investigation. But the fact that they even looked into it tells you something about how many deaths surrounded this woman. In February 2006, Lori married her fourth husband, Charles Vallow, a successful businessman who worked in finance and seemed like he might finally be the stable, responsible partner Lori needed in her life. Friends who knew them during the early years said it appeared to be a genuinely happy, functional marriage for quite a while. Together, they were raising Tylee, and Lori seemed devoted to being a good mother. Then in 2013, Charles and Lori adopted Charles's grandnephew, Joshua Jackson Vallow, who everyone called JJ. JJ's biological parents, Todd and Mandy Trahan, were unable to properly care for him due to ongoing substance abuse issues. JJ was born with drugs already in his tiny system and spent his first weeks of life in the neonatal intensive care unit fighting for survival. His grandparents, Kay and Larry Woodcock, who are Charles Vallow's sister and brother-in-law, stepped up immediately and took care of baby JJ for nearly his entire first year of life before Charles and Lori officially adopted him and brought him into their home. JJ was eventually diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, which meant he needed extra patience, consistent routine, specialized therapeutic care, and a lot of understanding. He wasn't severely autistic, but he had his challenges, and Charles seemed to handle it beautifully. April Raymond, who was close friends with Lori during this period of her life, later told reporters and testified that Lori had been patient with JJ and seemed like an ideal, devoted mother for a special needs child. Vasia Idaho, another friend who knew the Vallow family when they were living in Arizona, said that Tylee had completely embraced her role as JJ's big sister and even jokingly referred to JJ as her own child sometimes, showing that protective maternal instinct. From the outside looking in, it genuinely looked like Lori had finally found her happy ending after all those failed marriages. She had a loving, financially stable husband in Charles, 3 kids including adult son Colby, who was living his own life, a nice comfortable home in the suburbs, and a respected place in their local Mormon community. Nobody watching this family could have predicted the absolute nightmare that was coming. Because sometime around 2015, something fundamental started to shift and change in Lori. She became deeply interested in the apocalyptic books written by Chad Daybell, an obscure author who wrote both fiction and nonfiction about preparing for the end of the world and the second coming of Jesus Christ. At first, maybe it seemed relatively harmless to Charles and the family, just another hobby, just another book club type of thing that Lori was getting into. Mormon culture has plenty of people interested in preparedness and end times prophecy, so it probably didn't immediately ring alarm bells. But Lori didn't just casually read Chad's books like a normal book club member. She became completely obsessed with them, with Chad himself, with the apocalyptic ideas he was spreading about the imminent end times and past lives and spiritual warfare against dark forces. And by 2017, relatives say that Lori's entire relationship with her children started to noticeably change. The patience that April Raymond had praised was evaporating. The devoted, attentive mother was slowly transforming into someone else entirely, someone colder, more distant, more focused on her own spiritual journey than on her kids' needs. To truly understand how Lori Vallow ended up where she did, you absolutely have to understand Chad Daybell, because he's the person who provided the entire religious and theological framework that justified and enabled everything that followed. Chad Guy Daybell was born on August 11, 1968, in Provo, Utah, right in the heart of Mormon country, to a devout Latter-day Saints family. He grew up in the neighboring city of Springville, attending church every Sunday, going to seminary classes, living that typical Mormon upbringing. Chad was accepted and enrolled at Brigham Young University after graduating high school, planning to study journalism. But after just 1 year of college, he applied to become a full-time missionary for the LDS Church, and he spent 2 years serving a mission in New Jersey, going door to door, sharing the gospel, the whole missionary experience. After completing his mission, he returned to BYU and resumed his studies, eventually graduating with a Bachelor of Arts degree in journalism. On March 9, 1990, Chad married Tamara Douglas, who everyone in her life called Tammy. By all accounts from people who knew them, it seemed like a solid, stable Mormon marriage. They had 5 children together over the years, building what looked like a typical large Mormon family. Chad worked for a period of time as a copy editor for the Ogden Standard-Examiner newspaper, editing articles, fixing grammar, doing the behind-the-scenes work that newspapers need. And at various points during and after his university studies, he supported himself and his growing family by working as a gravedigger, and then as the cemetery sexton for the Springville Cemetery. There's something almost darkly poetic about that career choice when you think about where Chad's life trajectory eventually led. The man who would eventually become the central figure in multiple murder cases, whose own property would become a burial ground for murdered children, spent years of his life digging graves and maintaining a cemetery. He was literally surrounded by death every single working day, walking among tombstones, digging holes in the earth for coffins, and maybe that constant proximity to death shaped his worldview and his psychological state in ways that nobody around him fully understood or recognized at the time. Chad's first religion-themed novel, An Errand for Emma, was published in 1999 by the Springville-based publisher Cedar Fort, Incorporated, which specializes in Mormon and faith-based literature. In 2001, he published One Foot in the Grave, a nonfiction memoir that chronicled his personal experiences working in cemeteries, the stories of the dead, his thoughts on mortality and what comes after. Then in 2004, Chad and Tammy together founded their own publishing company called Spring Creek Book Company, which Chad primarily used to self-publish his increasingly apocalyptic beliefs regarding the end times, as well as other religion-themed books aimed specifically at a Mormon audience who were interested in preparedness and prophecy. By the end of the 2000s, the Daybells were facing serious financial problems. Chad's publishing business was bringing in an annual income of approximately just $2,000, which is basically poverty-level income, nowhere near enough to support a family with 5 children. Both Chad and Tammy had to work multiple part-time jobs just to supplement that meager income and keep the family afloat, with Chad working again as a cemetery sexton to make ends meet. Eventually, Chad managed to salvage his struggling publishing company and found a dedicated audience among people who were deeply concerned about and fascinated by the second coming of Jesus Christ and preparing for the end times. He became an increasingly popular author and speaker in certain radical, fringe Mormon circles, eventually publishing dozens of fiction and nonfiction books. His novels often depicted graphic apocalyptic situations and dystopian futures where the righteous survived catastrophic events, and he frequently featured characters that were clearly based on his own family members. In a memoir called Living on the Edge of Heaven, Chad made the extraordinary claim that he had experienced two separate near-death experiences that had supposedly allowed him to receive supernatural visions from beyond the veil, meaning from the spirit world that Mormons believe exists between earth and heaven. A recurring theme throughout all of Chad's writings was a supernatural voice, which he claimed was God or an angel, giving him specific instructions and direct advice, either to him personally or to his fictional characters. He commented in interviews, and this is a direct quote, "I don't fictionalize any of the events portrayed in my books. I'm really not that creative as a writer. My torn veil allows information to be downloaded directly into my brain from the other side. The scenes I am shown in visions are real events that will happen in the future." Think about that claim for a moment. Chad was essentially saying that he wasn't writing fiction at all, that he was documenting actual future events that God or angels were showing him through visions. That's not just confidence in your writing, that's claiming to be an actual prophet receiving direct revelation. Chad was also a regular, active contributor to a paid online forum called Another Voice of Warning, or AVOW for short, where he would discuss in detail his near-death experiences and share his thoughts and prophecies about the future of America and the world. Over time, Chad's religious beliefs became increasingly extreme, veering further and further away from mainstream Mormon doctrine. Jason Gwilliam, who is married to Tammy's sister and knew Chad well for years, later recalled that Chad's views had started noticeably changing around 2006 and 2007, as he became what Jason described as hyper-focused on preparing for the end of times, to an unhealthy degree. In 2010 or 2011, Chad started openly claiming that he was having regular visions about exactly how the end of the world would occur, specific details about earthquakes, tsunamis, wars. In 2013, he began publicly prophesying that there would be massive earthquakes, devastating wars, and widespread destruction specifically in the Americas within the next few years. During the 2010s, Chad became the publisher of an apocalyptic author and self-proclaimed clairvoyant named Julie Rowe. She and Chad made remarkably similar prophecies about the end times and made nearly identical claims about their own alleged connections to the spirit world and their abilities to see the future. Both became quite popular among Mormon preppers, people who believed the end of the world was imminent and were actively preparing, stockpiling food and supplies, considering regrouping in tent cities out in remote areas to await doomsday together. Suzanne Freeman, another author who was published by Chad's company for a while, later said publicly that she had stopped working with Chad Daybell in the 2010s specifically over her growing concerns about his increasing radicalization and his dangerous deviation from mainstream Mormon teachings. She said she became genuinely convinced that his beliefs had crossed a line and were actually dangerous to vulnerable people. In 2015, Chad claimed that he heard the voice of God telling him specifically to relocate from Utah to Rexburg, Idaho. He and Tammy packed up their entire lives and moved to Rexburg that June, settling into a modest home on a rural property just outside the small college town. Chad said that he had received a vision that Utah would be completely devastated by a catastrophic earthquake sometime in 2015 and that Idaho would be safer. Spoiler alert, that earthquake never happened. 2015 came and went with no earthquake, but Chad never acknowledged that his prophecy had failed. He just moved on to the next prediction. In October 2018, Lori attended a Preparing a People conference in Utah with her close friends Melanie Gibb and Zulema Pastines. This was where she met Chad Daybell face-to-face for the very first time, though she had been reading his books obsessively for years at that point. These conferences were gatherings of people interested in preparedness, survival skills, and end-times prophecy, and Chad was one of the featured speakers. Melanie Gibb and Zulema Pastines, who were both there with Lori, later told investigators, and testified in court that Lori had behaved in an extremely flirtatious manner with Chad at the conference, laughing at everything he said, touching his arm, making intense eye contact. Chad, for his part, claimed to Lori during their very first conversation that the two of them had been married to each other in multiple previous lifetimes across different time periods and planets. Just stop and think about how absolutely insane that sounds. Here's this middle-aged married man with 5 kids, telling a married woman with kids who he literally just met for the first time that they were destined soulmates who had been married across multiple incarnations. Any normal person would have backed away slowly and found someone else to talk to. But instead of being creeped out or calling him delusional, Lori absolutely ate it up. She was completely captivated. They exchanged contact information and started communicating privately after the conference ended. Shortly after their initial meeting, Charles Vallow had to go on a business trip, leaving Lori alone at home. She took advantage of his absence to hold a small overnight gathering at their house. Chad and Melanie Gibb were among the attendees, along with a few other people from the Preparing a People community. According to people who were there, Chad completely captivated Lori and the entire group that night by sharing his Mormon-influenced but highly unique beliefs about the end times, past lives, and the spirit world. Lori developed an intense, immediate attachment to Chad and his teachings. The two eventually became lovers, beginning an affair while both were still married to other people. On December 5, 2018, Chad and Lori appeared together on the Preparing a People podcast in an episode titled Time to Warrior Up, where they discussed spiritual warfare and preparing for tribulations. They were featured together in several other podcast episodes after that. A religious group gradually formed around Chad and his increasingly extreme teachings. Chad told Lori and his other followers that they belonged to something called the Church of the Firstborn, which he claimed was a special group of the most spiritually advanced souls, and he positioned himself as the leader of this church. The core group included Lori's niece Melanie Boudreaux, Melanie Gibb, Alex Cox, and Zulema Pastines, who eventually became Alex Cox's girlfriend and then his wife. Melanie Gibb and Lori even co-hosted their own podcast together called Feel the Fire, where they discussed their spiritual beliefs and preparations for the end times. Now here's where things get really dark, where these religious beliefs cross over from unusual into something that could actually justify murder. Reincarnation, which is explicitly not an accepted concept in mainstream LDS church doctrine, played a central and key part in Chad's personal religious worldview. He claimed that he personally had lived 31 previous lives on different planets across the universe, and that Lori had lived 21 separate lives, 5 of which had coincided and overlapped with his own experiences on Earth, meaning they had been together before. Lori eventually told Melanie Gibb that she and Chad were sealed together for eternity due to their marriages in their past lives, despite the inconvenient fact that their current spouses were still very much alive. When Gibb quite reasonably suggested that maybe Chad and Lori should just get divorced from their current spouses if they wanted to be together, Lori told her they were not allowed to divorce because of specific information they were receiving from the other side of the veil. In other words, they weren't allowed to get regular earthly divorces like normal people, because God or angels or spirits were giving them special instructions that superseded normal mortal rules. Chad also claimed to be the reincarnation of James the Less, one of Jesus Christ's 12 apostles, and that Lori had been James's wife in that lifetime under the name Elena. Chad further claimed that in other past lives, Lori had been Mary French, who was the great-grandmother of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, and that she had also been the wife of the prophet Moroni, a central figure in the Book of Mormon. According to Chad's teachings, these past lives were multiple probations on Earth, chances for souls to continue progressing toward exaltation, which is a belief shared by some Mormon fundamentalist groups who teach that multiple earthly probations are necessary for someone to reach the highest level of heaven. But the most dangerous and deadly part of Chad and Lori's entire belief system was what they called the light and dark scale. Chad created a system for categorizing people as either light or dark, based on his personal assessment of their spiritual affiliation with either Jesus Christ or Satan. He and Lori developed and employed a unique scoring system for measuring good and evil, assigning every single person they encountered a specific numerical rating on a scale from light to dark, from closest to God to closest to Satan. According to their twisted belief system, dark people were possessed and controlled by evil spirits that had taken over their bodies. The group would often gather together for castings, which were ceremonies where they would attempt to cast away these evil spirits through fervent prayers and intensive scripture readings, believing they had the power to drive out demons. They claimed that in some severe cases, possessed people could become what they called zombies. This didn't mean the Hollywood version of zombies, The Walking Dead. In Chad and Lori's belief system, a zombie was a living person whose original spirit had been completely pushed out of their body and replaced by an extremely dark spirit or demon. And according to their doctrine, the only way to truly banish a zombie, to free that body from the dark spirit controlling it, was to kill the physical person. Let that sink in. They believed that murdering certain people was actually a righteous act that freed those people's bodies from demonic possession. 7 women within the group, including Lori and Zulema Pastines, called themselves the 7 Gatherers, positioning themselves as specially chosen women who would gather the righteous for the end times. They would frequently perform castings together, sometimes meeting in person, sometimes doing them via Zoom video calls, praying intensely to cast out demons from people they had decided were possessed. Chad and Lori also scored people on what they called a vibration scale, and deemed those having sufficiently high vibrations to possess special supernatural powers or to potentially be translated, which in Mormon theology means being taken directly to heaven without dying, like the prophet Elijah in the Bible. Their increasingly bizarre beliefs also included detailed teachings about teleportation and something they called dark and light portals, which were supposedly doorways between the mortal world and the spirit world. Chad claimed that he personally could create these supernatural portals through his spiritual gifts, and that he used them to interact spiritually with Lori even when they were physically apart, to receive revelations directly from angels and departed spirits, and to travel to other spiritual realms without his physical body moving. And here's the prophecy that hung over everything like a dark cloud, the timeline that was driving their urgency. Chad specifically predicted that the world as we know it would come to a catastrophic end on July 22, 2020. He told his followers that he was constantly being guided by angels who showed him visions of the future, and that he could see hidden spiritual truths that normal people couldn't perceive. Lori claimed to have direct, regular communications with both God the Father and Jesus Christ. Lori came to genuinely believe that she was an exalted goddess, a divine being with visionary powers, and a crucial role to play in the end times. She and Chad taught their followers that they were personally destined to lead the 144,000 righteous people who would survive when the world ended, a reference to a number mentioned in the book of Revelation. Zulema Pastines later told investigators something absolutely chilling. Lori genuinely believed that because she was an exalted, translated being, a goddess operating on a higher plane, she literally couldn't be held accountable or responsible for her actions on Earth. Normal mortal laws didn't apply to her. She was above earthly justice. So when Lori and Chad started rating people in their lives on their light and dark scale, when they started determining who was possessed and who was a zombie, they weren't just making casual spiritual judgments. They were deciding who deserved to live and who needed to die for the greater good. And the people they rated as dark, as zombies whose bodies were possessed by evil spirits that needed to be eliminated. Those people included Charles Vallow, Lori's loyal husband who had stood by her through so much. They included Tammy Daybell, Chad's wife of nearly 30 years who had supported his career and raised his children. And most horrifyingly of all, They included Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow, Lori's own children, kids she had given birth to and raised. By February 2019, Lori's behavior had become increasingly erratic and alarming to everyone around her. She reportedly informed Charles bluntly that she no longer cared about him or JJ, just completely dismissed both of them from her life emotionally. Then she vanished for 58 days straight, just disappeared without telling Charles where she was going or when she'd be back. Imagine being Charles Vallow in this moment. Your wife, the woman you've built a life with over 13 years of marriage, the mother of the child you adopted together, just disappears for almost 2 full months and then comes back one day like absolutely nothing happened, offering no explanation. That same month, Charles finally filed for divorce, and in his divorce filing, he cited direct threats to his own life as well as accusations that Lori had stolen his truck and $35,000 from their joint bank accounts. According to the detailed divorce petition that Charles filed, Lori had told him during an argument that he was possessed by a dark spirit she called N. Schneider, that she herself was a god assigned to carry out the work of the 144,000 at Christ's second coming, which would happen in July 2020, and that she would murder him without hesitation if he got in the way of her divine mission. Those weren't vague threats. Those were specific, chilling statements about her willingness to kill him. Charles sought a protective order against Lori at the strong advice of his attorney, filing paperwork with the court to keep her away from him. But then, surprisingly, he withdrew the petition 1 month later, saying he wanted to try to make the marriage work, probably hoping that Lori would come to her senses or that he could somehow get her help. But Charles had become worried enough by Lori's escalating behavior and direct threats that in February 2019, before he withdrew the protective order, he made a crucial decision that may have saved his sister's life. He changed his $1 million life insurance policy so the beneficiary would be his sister Kay Woodcock rather than his wife Lori. Lori had absolutely no idea that Charles had made this change until after his death, and prosecutors later stated their belief that this change to the life insurance policy may very well have saved Kay Woodcock's life. If Lori had known that Kay was the beneficiary, Kay might have become a target herself. As it was, Lori had no financial incentive to harm Kay, so Kay survived. Arizona police detectives later retrieved hundreds of text messages between Chad, Lori, and her brother Alex Cox where they referred to Charles not by his actual name, but as End or Hiplos, which were the names of the dark spirit they claimed possessed his body. Charles wasn't Charles anymore in their minds. He was a zombie that needed to be dealt with. Lori told multiple members of her religious group that her husband had become a zombie whose body was possessed. Several followers repeatedly joined together in prayer circles, specifically praying for Charles's death, asking God to remove this obstacle from Lori's path. After discovering his wife's ongoing affair with Chad Daybell, Charles confronted Lori directly about it. 11 days before his death, on June 30th, 2019, Charles sent a detailed email to Tammy Daybell to inform her that their spouses were cheating on them and having an affair. He was trying to warn her, trying to get someone else to see what was happening. Evidence recovered from Tammy's email account later showed that she had opened and read Charles's message, then deleted it and blocked Charles's email address without responding or confronting Chad about the accusation. On July 1, 2019, Charles informed Lori that he planned to fly to Idaho and meet with Tammy Daybell in person to discuss the affair, since she hadn't responded to his email. At that point in time, investigators later discovered Lori and Chad were communicating constantly using burner phones, cheap prepaid phones that are harder to trace. On July 11, 2019, Charles went to Lori's home in Chandler, Arizona, early in the morning to pick up JJ, who was supposed to be flying with Charles to Louisiana to visit Kay and Larry Woodcock. Alex Cox was at the house. What exactly happened next has been reconstructed through police reports, witness testimony, forensic evidence, and the accounts of people who were there. An altercation occurred between Charles, Lori, and Alex. According to the story they told police, there was arguing, and Alex Cox shot and killed Charles with a handgun. Tylee, who was 16 at the time, told responding police officers that she had grabbed a baseball bat from her room after she heard Charles, Lori, and Alex arguing loudly, that Charles had taken the bat away from her because she was trying to get involved, and that she had then run away from the house with JJ, taking her little brother outside before the actual shooting occurred so JJ wouldn't witness violence. Alex Cox claimed self-defense to the responding officers, alleging that he had retrieved his personal gun from his vehicle after Charles violently struck him on the head with the baseball bat, and that he fired in fear for his life. But here's what makes this entire scenario deeply suspicious, and what ultimately led to conspiracy and murder charges. Lori did not call 911. She was there in the house when her husband was shot dead, and she didn't call for help. Based on detective testimony and cell phone records that were presented at both Lori and Chad's trials, the timeline of that morning reveals extremely disturbing gaps. Charles was shot at approximately 7:51 a.m. Lori had left the house at 7:49 a.m., just 2 minutes before the shooting, taking Charles's personal cell phone with her. At 7:52 a.m., 1 minute after Charles was shot, Alex called Lori's phone. At 8:06 a.m., 15 minutes after the shooting, Alex called Lori's phone a second time, meaning Charles had been lying dead or dying on the floor for at least 15 minutes while they were talking. Alex Cox didn't call 911 to report the shooting and request emergency services until 8:36 a.m., approximately 45 minutes after Charles was killed. 45 minutes. Let that number sink in. Charles Vallow was lying dead on the floor of Lori's house for approximately 45 minutes before anyone called for help or reported what had happened. During that 45-minute window, Alex and Lori were on the phone together at least twice, and based on what we know from cell phone records, most investigators agree that they were coordinating their stories and making sure they had their self-defense narrative straight before calling authorities. Moments after the shooting, while Charles's body was still in her house, Lori calmly took JJ to his elementary school like it was any other normal morning. On her way, she stopped at Burger King to get food and at Walgreens to buy flip-flops. A police detective later testified during the Arizona trial that Lori's behavior throughout that entire day had been oddly and disturbingly nonchalant, and that she had seemed completely unaffected by the situation, showing no signs of shock, grief, or distress over her husband being shot dead in her home just hours earlier. Zulema Pastines, who later married Alex Cox, told investigators that Alex had confided in her that he did not feel even remotely bad or guilty about killing Charles because he had killed a zombie, not a real person. He genuinely believed he had done something righteous. Investigations conducted after Lori's arrest later showed that 2 days before the shooting, on July 9th, Lori had sent her brother Alex a text message that told him to be like Nephi. Police and prosecutors interpreted that message as a command to kill a wicked man, referencing the Book of Mormon story where the prophet Nephi kills a man named Laban because God commands him to do it for the greater good. Despite all these suspicious circumstances, no criminal charges were filed at the time. The Chandler Police Department investigated, interviewed witnesses, and ultimately accepted Alex Cox's self-defense claim. The case was closed. Lori texted Charles's adult sons from his previous marriage to inform them that their father had passed away, then left them without any further information or support for 3 full days. Charles's sons had to find out on their own which mortuary had their father's body. They were left to organize a memorial service by themselves, which Lori did not attend. Before Charles's death, his attorneys had stated that he was primarily concerned for JJ's safety and well-being, knowing that the boy needed consistent routine and specialized care due due to his autism. Charles was also deeply concerned for Tylee, but he was unable to include her in his divorce filings and custody requests because she was neither his biological daughter nor had he ever filed to legally adopt her, so he had no legal standing regarding her custody. Days after Charles was killed and buried, Chad Daybell sent Lori a lengthy love story in the form of a series of text messages. This story, which investigators later called a romance novel, told the elaborate fictional tale of the meeting of James and Alina, which were the names Chad substituted for himself and Lori, and included graphic, detailed descriptions of their sexual relationship across multiple past lives. While Charles's body was barely cold in the ground, while his children were mourning and trying to plan a funeral, Chad and Lori were sexting each other with detailed erotic stories about their supposed past lives together. It's genuinely stomach-turning. By the end of August 2019, about 6 weeks after Charles's death, Lori relocated to Rexburg, Idaho, bringing her children JJ and Tylee with her. They moved into a townhouse apartment in a quiet residential complex. Alex Cox also moved to Rexburg at the same time, renting an apartment in the exact same complex as Lori, just down the hall. This move conveniently brought Lori physically much closer to Chad Daybell, who lived with his wife Tammy on a rural property just outside Rexburg, maybe a 15 or 20-minute drive away. Just before moving from Arizona to Idaho, Lori made a decision that seemed cruel to anyone who understood JJ's needs. She sold his service dog. JJ's autism meant that he relied heavily on routine, consistency, and support systems to navigate daily life and regulate his emotions. That specially trained service dog would have helped him manage sensory overload, provided comfort during stressful transitions, and given him stability. Lori got rid of the dog like it was just an inconvenient piece of furniture she didn't want to move. While Lori and her children were living in Rexburg, neighbors started noticing concerning things. They saw JJ displaying erratic, unsupervised behavior, often left outside alone in the apartment complex courtyard for long periods of time without any adult watching him, which is dangerous for any 7-year-old, but especially concerning for a child with special needs. When neighbors confronted Lori about leaving JJ unsupervised, asking if everything was okay, she didn't mention that JJ was autistic or explain his specific needs. Instead, she dismissively told them that he was her niece's drug baby, distancing herself from him, reframing him in her own mind and to others as someone else's damaged child, someone else's problem, not really her responsibility. Tylee Ryan was last seen alive on September 8, 2019 at Yellowstone National Park. There's a photo from that day, taken during what should have been a fun family outing, showing Tylee standing near a river with the beautiful Yellowstone landscape behind her. She's wearing a blue sweatshirt, her long brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she's looking off to the side with this expression that's honestly hard to read. It might be boredom, it might be sadness, it might be teenage indifference. That photograph would become one of the most haunting, widely circulated images of this entire case, because it was the absolute last confirmed sighting of Tylee alive. She was never enrolled at any school in Idaho, even though Lori had told people that Tylee was attending BYU, Idaho as a college student. Based on photograph timestamps and metadata, investigators later determined with precision that Tylee returned home to Lori's apartment after that Yellowstone trip at 8:37 p.m. on September 8. Cell phone data extracted from Alex Cox's phone showed him traveling with the family to Yellowstone, returning to Lori's apartment complex, stopping for gas, and going to his own apartment in the same complex. Then later that night, between 2:42 a.m. and 3:37 a.m. on September 9, in the middle of the night, Alex Cox's phone pinged at Lori's apartment. Most investigators agree that this highly unusual overnight visit to his sister's apartment, during hours when he typically would have been sleeping at his own residence, strongly suggests that something significant and urgent occurred that required his immediate presence. In the morning of September 9, Alex Cox left his own apartment at 9 a.m. and drove directly to Chad Daybell's rural property. He stayed there, with his cell phone pinging locations at the back of the residence near the backyard, until approximately 11:45 a.m. when he drove away to a Del Taco fast food restaurant. At 9:48 a.m. on September 9, just 14 minutes after Alex Cox's phone showed him arriving at Chad Daybell's property, Chad sent a text message to his wife Tammy, who was at work. The text read, and this is verbatim, "I spotted a big raccoon along the fence. I hurried and got my gun, and he was still walking along. I got close enough that one shot did the trick. He is now in our pet cemetery." Raccoons are normally strictly nocturnal animals, active at night and sleeping during the day. So finding one actively walking around at almost 10 o'clock in the morning was immediately suspicious and unusual to investigators when they later read this text. But what made this seemingly innocent text message about shooting a pest truly bone-chilling was what investigators would eventually discover 9 months later when they excavated Chad's property. There was no raccoon buried in that pet cemetery. When they finally got a search warrant and dug up the area Chad had referred to as his pet cemetery, in June 2020, they found Tylee Ryan's remains buried there exactly where Chad had texted about burying a raccoon. Tylee's body had been burned with fire. Her hands had been deliberately cut off. Her bones were fractured in multiple places, which forensic examiners determined meant that someone had attempted to dismember her body, to cut it into pieces. Dr. Garth Warren, the forensic pathologist who conducted Tylee's autopsy, testified that her remains were delivered to him in multiple separate bags, severely charred and destroyed to a degree he had rarely seen in his career. The autopsy took approximately a week to complete because her remains were in such terrible condition. Through a variety of forensic tests and analysis, Dr. Warren testified that there was no evidence to support that Tylee was alive when her body was burned, meaning someone killed her first, then burned and dismembered her afterwards. Because of the severe state of her remains, Tylee's exact cause of death could not be determined, and her death was officially ruled a homicide by unspecified means. Tylee's DNA was found on both a pickaxe and a shovel that were seized from Chad Daybell's garage during the search. JJ Vallow last attended Kennedy Elementary School in Rexburg on September 20, 2019. A neighbor's doorbell security camera captured the last known video footage of JJ on September 17, 2019, showing him playing outside by himself in the apartment complex courtyard where Lori lived. He's running around, being a kid, just a little boy who has no idea what's coming. On September 22, 2019, Lori's friend Melanie Gibb and Melanie's boyfriend David Warwick were staying as guests at Lori's townhouse apartment. They were visiting from out of town. Around 10:30 p.m. that night, David Warwick witnessed Alex Cox carry JJ, who was sleeping, upstairs to JJ's bedroom and put him to bed. This was the absolute last confirmed sighting of JJ Vallow alive. On the next morning, September 23rd, when Melanie and David woke up, JJ was absent from the apartment. Lori told them that JJ had been misbehaving badly the night before after they went to bed, and that his uncle Alex had come over and picked him up to give Lori a break. Melanie later testified that she found this explanation odd because she had seen JJ sleeping peacefully when Alex carried him to bed. On September 23, JJ had an unexcused absence from school. The next day, September 24th, Lori contacted Rexburg Elementary School and informed them that she would now be homeschooling JJ and that he wouldn't be returning to their school. But JJ wasn't being homeschooled. Based on what we know from all the evidence presented at trial, including the forensic evidence and timeline, JJ was most likely already dead. Cell phone location data showed that on the morning of September 23, Alex Cox traveled to Chad Daybell's house and was physically present on the property between 9:55 a.m. and 10:12 a.m. a span of just 17 minutes, before driving to Lori's apartment. Investigators later testified that after examining the grave where JJ was found and assessing how deep it was, it likely would have taken longer than 17 minutes for one person working alone to dig the grave, but it could definitely have been done in that time frame with 2 or more people working together, or with more advanced equipment like a small excavator. JJ's small body was found carefully wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and black garbage bags, buried under a pile of rocks and wooden planks near a pond on Chad Daybell's property. Unlike Tylee's brutally dismembered and burned remains, JJ had been buried with what almost seemed like care at first glance, his small body carefully wrapped. But the autopsy revealed the absolutely horrifying truth about how this 7-year-old autistic boy had died. Dr. Garth Warren testified that when they received JJ's body at the medical examiner's office for autopsy, they found a white plastic bag placed over his entire head, secured with duct tape wrapped around his head multiple times. Duct tape was also tightly bound around his small forearms, around his hands, and around his ankles, essentially binding him so he couldn't fight back or remove the bag. The official cause of death was asphyxiation caused by a plastic bag being placed over his head and duct tape being placed over his mouth, suffocating him. Dr. Warren testified that there were no other signs of disease or physical trauma to his internal organs, including his ribs and lungs. He wasn't beaten or poisoned. Someone simply put a plastic bag over his head, taped his mouth shut so he couldn't scream, bound his small hands and ankles so he couldn't struggle or pull the bag off, and let him slowly suffocate to death in terror. JJ Vallow was 7 years old. He had autism and needed patience and understanding. He loved his family and his routine. And someone, likely someone he knew and trusted, murdered him in one of the most cruel ways imaginable. DNA analysis later revealed that a hair found stuck to the duct tape wrapped around JJ's body belonged to Lori Vallow Daybell. Alex Cox's fingerprints were also found on both the plastic bags and the duct tape binding JJ's body. In all the months that followed her children's disappearances and deaths, Lori kept collecting the Social Security survivor benefits that JJ and Tylee each received monthly after the deaths of their respective fathers, essentially committing fraud by collecting money for dead children. In October 2019, 2 Venmo payments were made from Tylee's account to her older half-brother Colby Ryan, with cheerful love-expressing messages attached like everything was fine. When Colby later expressed concern directly to Tylee via text message, saying he was worried about her and asking if she was okay, he received responses from Tylee's cell phone indicating that she was safe and happy but just really busy with school and couldn't talk right now. But those texts weren't from Tylee. Someone else, almost certainly Lori, was using Tylee's phone to maintain the illusion that she was still alive. After repeated calls to Tylee went unanswered and his texts got increasingly suspicious responses, Colby became more and more worried that something was genuinely wrong. Brandon Boudreaux and Melanie Gibb both later testified that Lori and Chad were absolutely convinced that Tylee and JJ were possessed by dark spirits and had become zombies, whose original spirits had left their bodies. Zulema Pastines testified that Chad had told his close followers that JJ would die soon, but that it was okay because JJ's spirit would leave his body and then come back reincarnated as Colby Ryan's future son, so he wasn't really dying, just transferring. The FBI uncovered text messages between Lori and Chad where they explicitly discussed Tylee and JJ's alleged possession by dark spirits and mentioned having a perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children, which prosecutors interpreted as clear evidence of premeditated murder conspiracy. Another text exchange between Lori and Alex Cox mentioned working on Z's, which everyone understood to be a reference to zombies, to the people they had rated as dark and marked for death. In February 2019, months before any of the actual murders occurred, Chad Daybell told his neighbors Todd and Alice Gilbert during a casual conversation that he had received a vision showing him that his wife Tammy would die before her 50th birthday. He was already planting seeds, already preparing people around him for his wife's death before it happened, laying groundwork. On October 9, 2019, just 1 month after Tylee Ryan was murdered and buried, Tammy Daybell reported to police that she had been shot at in her own driveway by a masked man carrying what she believed was a paintball gun. She told officers that the man had pulled the trigger several times while pointing the gun directly at her, but thankfully the gun was apparently unloaded or had misfired, so she wasn't injured. Local police initially believed this incident was just a prank, probably teenagers messing around, and they were unable to identify the masked man. But Alex Cox's cell phone location data showed his phone near the Daybell's residence on October 9, just 4 hours before Tammy reported being shot at. Police later found an AR-15 rifle at Alex Cox's home that closely resembled the description Tammy had given of the supposed paintball gun. Cox had made several suspicious internet searches in the days before October 9, including searches about the use and specifications of an AR-15 rifle, searches about how a Grendel round would impact a Dodge Dakota pickup truck, which was the exact vehicle the Daybells owned, and searches about ballistic trajectories. Prosecutors later stated their belief that the paintball gun Tammy spotted on October 9 was actually a real loaded firearm that had either jammed mechanically or misfired, and that the shooter was almost certainly Alex Cox, attempting to kill Tammy but failing. Zulema Pastines testified that she had been with both Lori and Lori's niece Melanie on the night of October 9 to participate in a casting ceremony, attempting to cast out evil spirits. At some point during that evening, Lori talked to someone on her cell phone and became extremely angry and agitated, calling the person on the other end idiot, moron, stupid, repeatedly. After hanging up the phone, she commented out loud with obvious frustration, "Idiot can't do anything by himself." Based on the timing and context, this could strongly imply that Lori was talking to Alex about his failed attempt to murder Tammy, berating him for failing the mission. 10 days later, on October 19, 2019, Tammy Daybell was found dead in her bed, apparently having died in her sleep from natural causes. Chad claimed to first responders that Tammy had gone to bed the previous night with a terrible cough and had died peacefully in her sleep sometime during the night. He said that Tammy had been experiencing low blood pressure, occasional seizures, and negative reactions to various homeopathic medicines she was taking, though absolutely nothing in Tammy's actual medical records supported any of these claims. There was no documented history of seizures or dangerous low blood pressure. Tammy's funeral was organized in Utah just 3 days after her death, which struck some people as remarkably fast. Alice Gilbert, Chad's neighbor, later testified that she had been genuinely surprised that the funeral came so soon after Tammy's death, and that it had felt oddly planned in advance, like Chad had already made all the arrangements. The Gilberts also testified that unlike his 5 children, who were clearly devastated and grieving, Chad did not seem remotely upset and had acted in a cold, businesslike manner throughout the funeral. Chad's sister-in-law, Heather Daybell, said that Chad's behavior and emotional responses at Tammy's funeral did not ring true at all, and that he just didn't seem upset, the way a man who just lost his wife of 30 years should be. Jason Gwilliam, who is married to Tammy's sister, said that he felt Chad was not crying but trying to cry, putting on a performance of grief. During the funeral service itself, Chad mentioned in his eulogy that Tammy had suffered from depression, commented that she was not easy to live with, and actually called his dead wife lazy in front of their children and extended family. Tammy's body was not autopsied initially because Chad refused to consent to one, and the coroner accepted his decision and signed off on natural causes. But in December 2019, After Tylee and JJ were reported missing and investigators started connecting all these mysterious deaths together, Tammy's body was exhumed from her grave for a proper autopsy. The autopsy results were completed by February 2021, but were kept sealed and not publicly revealed until April 2023 during Lori's murder trial. Dr. Eric Christensen, Utah's chief medical examiner, testified about his findings. Tammy Daybell died from asphyxiation, being deprived of oxygen. During the autopsy, Dr. Christensen discovered bruises on Tammy's body that had likely occurred very close to the time she died, within hours. These bruises were found on her arms and chest, and Dr. Christensen stated that the bruising patterns were consistent with someone being physically restrained, held down. He said the bruises were from acute injuries that occurred most likely prior to her death, probably in the few hours immediately before her death. Dr. Christensen also noted that pink foam was found around Tammy's mouth and in her airways. This foam is a fluid that leaks into airways when people die from asphyxiation, and it was a significant factor in ruling out other potential causes of death like a heart attack or stroke. The autopsy also revealed physical signs that Tammy had been laying flat on her back immediately after her death for an extended period of time. Police officers who responded to Chad's 911 call reported that Tammy's body was already stiff with rigor mortis and completely cold to the touch when they arrived, which typically happens after a person has been dead for at least 1 to 2 hours minimum, possibly much longer. Dr. Christensen estimated based on the physical evidence that Tammy had died several hours before Chad actually reported her death and called 911. Cell phone location data placed Alex Cox's phone at a church parking lot approximately 2.6 miles from the Daybell home between 10:07 p.m. and 10:45 p.m. on October 18, the night before Tammy died. Tammy's estimated time of death based on autopsy findings is sometime in the early morning hours of October 19. Investigators later uncovered text messages between Chad and Lori where they claimed that Tammy was spiritually in limbo and that her body was possessed by a dark spirit they had named Viola. At some point before her death, Chad and Lori had told their inner circle of followers that Tammy had become a zombie. According to police reports and financial records, Chad received life insurance payouts after Tammy's death totaling $430,000 from multiple policies. Investigators later found in Lori's internet browsing history that she had ordered a matching pair of wedding rings online in August 2019, several months before Tammy's death, already planning their wedding. Even more disturbing, Lori had searched online for wedding dresses on the exact same day as Tammy's funeral and burial, while Chad was supposedly grieving. On October 2, 2019, right in the middle of all these deaths and disappearances, there was yet another attempted murder that investigators believe is connected to this conspiracy. Brandon Boudreaux, the estranged husband of Lori's niece Melanie, was shot at from a moving vehicle while driving home from work in Gilbert, Arizona. A bullet was fired at Brandon's head from a Jeep that pulled up alongside his vehicle, and the bullet missed his head by literally inches, hitting the frame of his car window instead. If the shooter's aim had been just slightly better, Brandon would have been killed instantly. Brandon, who had been close to Charles and Lori Vallow's family for years through his marriage to Melanie, immediately recognized the Jeep as a vehicle that had been used by Tylee Ryan. The Jeep sped away quickly after the shot was fired, but Brandon was able to clearly see and give police the license plate number. Police ran the plates and identified the Jeep as being registered to Charles Vallow, who had been shot dead in Lori's home just 3 months earlier. Melanie Boudreaux had become extremely involved with her Aunt Lori's religious activities and apocalyptic beliefs during 2018. She had insisted that she and Brandon buy extensive food stockpiles to prepare for the end of the world, spending thousands of dollars. During the summer of 2019, Melanie had suddenly and unexpectedly demanded a divorce from Brandon, which came completely out of nowhere from his perspective. The divorce was not yet finalized when the shooting attempt occurred. Brandon said that he had been totally blindsided by Melanie's divorce request, which he directly blamed on her deep involvement in her Aunt Lori's cult and extremist beliefs. Brandon, who strongly suspected that Lori and her brother Alex were responsible for Charles Vallow's death, hired a private investigator after the shooting attempt to look into the connections. After it became widely known that Tylee and JJ were missing, Brandon became absolutely convinced that Charles's death, the children's disappearance, and the attempt on his own life were all connected to Lori's religious group and their beliefs about dark spirits and zombies. He suspected that the murder attempt against him was primarily motivated by his life insurance policy, that if he died, Melanie would inherit money that she would then share with Lori. By carefully tracking Alex Cox's cell phone location data, investigators later discovered that Cox had made several internet searches for specific directions to Brandon Boudreaux's home address and workplace. His phone had been physically present near Brandon's home during the hours immediately before the shooting occurred. Alex had also made multiple internet searches about how to load ammunition, about ballistic trajectory calculators, and immediately after the shooting, he had searched for news articles about man shot in Gilbert. On the day of the actual shooting, Cox and Lori had communicated by phone several times, with calls going back and forth between them. Later that same day, Lori had also made her own internet searches looking for news about a shooting in Gilbert, Arizona. Surveillance video footage from a storage unit facility in Rexburg later showed Lori renting a storage unit on October 1st. Then surveillance video footage from a storage unit facility in Rexburg later showed Lori renting a storage unit on October 1st. Then Chad and Lori bringing a tire and a seat from Charles Vallow's Jeep on October 2nd, the day of Brandon's shooting. Then on October 3rd, Alex Cox and Lori were filmed retrieving those items. This strongly implies that the Jeep's configuration and appearance were deliberately changed on October 2nd to make it harder to identify after it was used in the shooting. Surveillance footage also showed that Cox visited a window tinting business called Dan's Window Tinting in Rexburg multiple times in late September, and Brandon Boudreaux reported to police that he was shot at by someone driving a Jeep with freshly tinted dark windows that looked exactly like Tylee's vehicle. On November 24, 2019, Chad Daybell gave Alex Cox what's called a patriarchal blessing, which in Mormon culture is typically a sacred religious ceremony performed by someone with proper priesthood authority. Chad had absolutely no official standing or authority to give such blessings in the LDS Church, but he did it anyway. In this recorded blessing, which was later found by investigators on Lori's iCloud account, Chad said that Alex had assisted him and Lori in ways that can never be repaid. Think about what that means. Chad called Alex a prophet and a hero, and he predicted that Alex would have an important future as a messenger of the Lord. This blessing was essentially Chad thanking Alex for all the murders and attempted murders, for being their loyal enforcer. Alex Cox died suddenly on December 12, 2019, at his home in Arizona. His death was officially attributed to bilateral pulmonary thromboemboli, which are blood clots that formed in both of his lungs simultaneously, along with complications from high blood pressure. The day before his death, Alex Cox had been informed by Lori and Chad that police in Idaho were planning to exhume Tammy Daybell's body for an autopsy because they were investigating her death as potentially suspicious. Zulema Pastines, who had married Alex just a few weeks earlier, later testified that Alex had told her he was genuinely worried about becoming Lori and Chad's fall guy, meaning he feared they would blame everything on him if investigations continued. Alex Cox was the person who shot and killed Charles Vallow in July. His cell phone location data placed him at Chad Daybell's property on the mornings immediately after both Tylee and JJ were last seen alive. His fingerprints were found on the duct tape that bound JJ Vallow's body. His phone data placed him near Tammy Daybell's home the night she died. His phone data and internet searches connected him to the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. Alex Cox was physically present for every single murder and attempted murder in this entire case. He was the one who actually did the killing in most instances, the one with blood literally on his hands. And then, right when multiple investigations were intensifying, right when police were starting to connect all these deaths together and focus on the Daybell case, Alex Cox died suddenly of what was ruled natural causes. The timing was incredibly, almost impossibly convenient for Lori and Chad. With Alex dead and buried, there was no one left alive who could testify about what really happened behind the scenes, no one who could make a deal with prosecutors and explain exactly who did what and who gave which orders. Was Alex Cox's death really just natural causes, just terrible timing? The official medical ruling said yes, but given absolutely everything else in this case, given how many people connected to Lori Vallow ended up dead at convenient moments, it's genuinely hard not to wonder. Some people have speculated that Lori or Chad may have given Alex something to deliberately cause the blood clots, but there's absolutely no evidence to support that theory, and investigators thoroughly examined his death and ruled it natural. Chad Daybell introduced Lori to his 5 adult children the day immediately after Tammy's funeral, just one day after burying their mother. 1 week after Tammy's death, Chad also told his neighbors Todd and Alice Gilbert that he had found the woman he was going to marry, talking about Lori with obvious excitement. Days later, Chad brought Lori to meet the Gilberts in person. Alice Gilbert described the entire situation as deeply awkward, with Chad and Lori constantly laughing and giggling together and being extremely physically affectionate with each other, more affectionate than Alice had ever seen Chad be with Tammy in all the years they'd been neighbors. During that meeting, Chad casually mentioned that Lori recently had a daughter who had passed away, referring to Tylee. Not that Tylee was missing, that she had passed away, past tense, dead. Chad told Tammy's own sister, Samantha Gwilliam, that Tammy's spirit had personally appeared to him at the cemetery during the burial and had directly advised him to move on with his life and find happiness again. He also told Samantha that he and Lori had bonded over their recently deceased spouses and that Lori conveniently had no children, so they would be empty nesters together who could travel and enjoy life. That's what he told Tammy's own grieving sister, that Lori had no children. This conversation happened in early November 2019. JJ and Tylee had been dead for maybe 6 or 7 weeks at that point, buried in shallow graves in Chad's own backyard, and he was already telling people that Lori didn't have kids. Chad and Lori were married in a beach ceremony in Kauai, Hawaii, on November 5, 2019. That's exactly 2 weeks after Tammy's death, and roughly 2 months after Tylee and JJ were murdered and buried. Apart from briefly informing his children, Chad did not tell his extended family beforehand about the wedding. Chad's elderly mother discovered that Chad and Lori were married only when she met Lori in person after they returned. The newlyweds were photographed multiple times on the beaches of Kauai, dancing barefoot in the sand, smiling for selfies, looking absolutely carefree and joyful. Lori and Chad returned to Hawaii shortly after the wedding and took up residence in a gated community in Princeville on the island of Kauai, living primarily off the $430,000 that Chad had received from Tammy's life insurance policies. While searching for a permanent home to buy in Hawaii, Chad wrote on a rental application that the couple had no children, despite the fact that his wife's 2 youngest children had been missing for months and police hadn't found them. On November 26, 2019, Rexburg police officers visited Lori's townhouse for a welfare check on JJ at the urgent request of his grandmother, Kay Woodcock. Kay hadn't heard from JJ in months and was desperately, frantically worried. A police detective initially found Chad Daybell and Alex Cox at Lori's townhouse when they knocked. Both men immediately acted extremely suspiciously and nervously. Alex Cox, apparently not knowing that it was Kay Woodcock who had specifically requested the welfare check, claimed to officers that JJ was currently in Arizona with his grandmother Kay. Chad, whom the detective obviously knew was married to Lori based on public records, bizarrely claimed that he was just a friend of Alex and that he hardly knew Lori at all. Think about that absurd lie. Chad Daybell told police officers with a straight face that he hardly knew the woman he had literally just married 3 weeks earlier. Police later reached Lori by phone, and she claimed that JJ was in Arizona staying with her friend Melanie Gibb. However, when police immediately contacted Melanie Gibb to verify this story, Gibb stated clearly that JJ had not been with her for several months, not since September. That night, a neighbor observed Lori and Alex Cox frantically packing boxes into a truck outside Lori's townhouse, clearly preparing to flee. The following day, when police and FBI agents arrived to search the house and question Lori further, the townhouse was completely abandoned. Empty. They were gone. Chad's home in Idaho was also searched by investigators on November 27th. They didn't find the children, but they collected evidence. Lori and Chad fled back to Hawaii immediately. On December 20, 2019, the Rexburg Police Department held a press conference and publicly announced that Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow were officially missing and asked for the public's help in locating them. Investigators expressed serious concern for the children's safety, clearly stating that they believed the children were not with Chad and Lori, that Lori had completely refused to cooperate with the investigation, and that she had chosen to leave Idaho with Chad instead of helping find her missing kids. Police also announced that the children's disappearance could be directly linked to Tammy Daybell's suspicious death. The next day, police publicly named Lori and Chad as persons of interest. The case soon received massive national media coverage, with family members and friends describing Chad and Lori's cult-like beliefs in interviews and on social media posts. The story was everywhere. Colby Ryan, JJ's grandparents Larry and Kay Woodcock, and Chad's brother Matt Daybell all issued public messages, desperately asking Lori and Chad to please return the children safely. On January 7, 2020, the Woodcocks held an emotional press conference in Rexburg, offering a $20,000 reward for the children's safe return, or for any information leading to finding them. On January 25, 2020, after Lori and Chad were located living in Hawaii, law enforcement agents personally served them with a court order requiring Lori to physically produce, within 5 days, either Tylee or JJ to the Idaho Department of Welfare or to the Rexburg Police Department. Produce the children or face arrest. The next day, police seized the couple's rental car and executed a search warrant on their rental townhome in Princeville. Inside, they found Tylee's debit card and JJ's iPad, but no children. Also on January 26, Lori and Chad were confronted in person over the children's disappearance by East Idaho News reporter Nate Eaton, who tracked them down in Hawaii. The confrontation was captured on video. They refused to answer any questions, walking away from the cameras. When the 5-day deadline passed and Lori completely failed to produce the children or provide any proof they were alive, she was arrested in Hawaii on February 20, 2020. She was charged with 2 felony counts of desertion and non-support of dependent children. Her bail was initially set at $5 million. On March 5, she was extradited back to Idaho to face charges. In February 2020, authorities focused intensely on a storage locker in Rexburg that had been rented by Lori in October 2019. When they finally obtained a warrant and opened it, they discovered belongings that clearly belonged to Tylee and JJ, including children's clothing, bikes, backpacks, toys, and family photographs. These precious items had been abandoned and left behind when Lori abruptly fled Rexburg in late November 2019. Video surveillance footage captured Lori and Alex Cox moving numerous items to and from the storage locker in the weeks before her departure. But even after Lori's arrest and imprisonment, even facing serious felony charges, she absolutely refused to say where the children were. She wouldn't tell investigators, wouldn't tell prosecutors, wouldn't tell her own son Colby. Chad Daybell, back in Idaho, actually tried to convince his neighbors, the Gilberts, to put their home up as collateral for bond money to get Lori out of jail, claiming that Jesus Christ had personally given him this idea in a vision. When Alice Gilbert directly asked Chad about the missing children and confronted him about what he had said earlier about Lori's daughter being dead, Chad answered dismissively that it was just a custody issue and that everything would be resolved soon. He added at some point that Tylee didn't like people and didn't like him, speaking about her entirely in the past tense. On June 9, 2020, the FBI, Rexburg Police Department, and Fremont County Sheriff's Office descended upon Chad Daybell's home and property with search warrants, excavation equipment, and cadaver dogs. Authorities had finally decided to search the property thoroughly after carefully analyzing months of Alex Cox's cell phone location data, and realizing that his phone had pinged multiple times at Chad's property on the specific mornings after the children disappeared. Investigators began systematically digging in areas of the backyard where Alex Cox's cell phone had repeatedly pinged in September 2019. The FBI had also obtained and carefully analyzed the September 9th text message conversation between Chad and his wife Tammy, where Chad claimed he had shot a large raccoon and buried it in their pet cemetery. Tragically, investigators quickly uncovered human remains buried in multiple shallow graves in Chad's backyard. JJ Vallow had been buried under a tree near a pond. About 50 yards away, investigators found a second grave in the pet cemetery area. Prosecutors believe Tylee was buried in the exact same location Chad had referenced 9 months earlier when he texted Tammy about burying a raccoon. Investigators completely excavated part of the pet cemetery area and found no raccoon whatsoever, just Tylee's burned, dismembered remains. As the property was actively being searched and investigators were beginning to unearth the bodies, Chad frantically phoned Lori in jail to warn her about what was happening, telling her that police were digging up his backyard. After police found and began to carefully unearth and document the children's bodies, Chad tried to get in his vehicle and drive off from the scene. He was chased down by law enforcement, stopped, and immediately apprehended. He was arrested on the spot for obstruction and concealment of evidence. On June 10th, the Woodcock and Ryan families received the devastating news and confirmed through DNA that the human remains found on Chad's property were those of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow. This heartbreaking finding was officially confirmed to the public by Rexburg police 3 days later. A makeshift memorial was quickly built along the Daybell property fence by community members to honor the victims, with people leaving flowers, stuffed animals, candles, and handwritten notes. On May 25, 2021, Chad and Lori were both indicted by a grand jury on multiple charges of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder for the deaths of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy, as well as grand theft by deception regarding the Social Security benefits collected for dead children. Lori was additionally charged with grand theft related to continuing to collect her children's Social Security survivor benefits for months after their deaths. Chad faced an insurance fraud charge related to the life insurance policies he collected after Tammy's death. In June 2021, Lori was separately indicted by a grand jury in Maricopa County, Arizona, on one count of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder for the death of Charles Vallow. Police documents stated, "The evidence shows that Charles's death was a planned event and necessary to prevent Charles and others from confronting Lori about her extreme religious beliefs when he came to town. The death of Charles Vallow was also necessary in order for Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow to marry and fulfill their religious prophecy." In 2022, Lori was indicted by another grand jury on one additional count of first-degree premeditated conspiracy to commit murder related to the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. Lori and Chad both pleaded not guilty to absolutely all charges in Idaho. Their cases were split and separated in March 2023 at Chad Daybell's specific request through his attorney. Lori's trial began on April 3, 2023, in Boise, Idaho. Attorneys had summoned 1,800 potential jurors to the courthouse in late March, requiring each of them to complete a detailed 20-page questionnaire designed to weed out anyone who couldn't fairly try this extremely high-profile case. Ultimately, 12 jurors and 6 alternates were selected and heard the case. On April 10th, the prosecution and defense made their opening arguments to the jury. Melanie Gibb testified extensively about the light and dark rating system and the zombie beliefs that Chad and Lori had taught their followers. She explained in detail how Chad and Lori would rate specific people on their spiritual scale, how they genuinely believed that dark people were possessed by demons and needed to be eliminated from the earth. Dr. Garth Warren, the forensic pathologist, presented the absolutely graphic, disturbing details of the children's remains and how they died. He described finding JJ's small body wrapped in layers of plastic with a bag over his head, duct tape binding his mouth, arms, and ankles. He described Tylee's charred, dismembered remains being delivered to him in multiple separate bags. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of clear financial motives, showing the jury how Lori kept collecting Social Security benefits for both children for months after they were dead, essentially stealing money meant for murdered children. They showed DNA evidence linking Lori's hair to the duct tape that bound JJ's body. They showed detailed cell phone location data placing Alex Cox at Chad's property immediately after each child disappeared. They showed text messages between Lori and Chad explicitly discussing zombies and their perfectly orchestrated plan. On May 12, 2023, after deliberating for several hours, an Idaho jury found Lori Vallow Daybell guilty on all charges presented. She was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow, 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of the children and Tammy Daybell, and 2 counts of grand theft. On July 31, 2023, Lori was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty allowed under Idaho law. She was also given a consecutive 10-year sentence for the grand theft charges, as well as ordered to pay more than $50,000 in total, including court fines, a civil penalty for each of the 3 murder victims, and restitution to families. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Stephen Boyce directly addressed Lori and said, "You had so many other options available to you. You could have gotten divorced from Charles. You could have found someone else to take care of those kids if you didn't want them. And as the state was able to prove at trial, you chose the most evil and destructive path possible. You justified all of this by going down a bizarre religious rabbit hole, and clearly you are still down there." When Lori was given the opportunity to speak at her sentencing, she declined to address the court directly but submitted a written statement maintaining her complete innocence and bizarrely claiming that no one was actually murdered. She wrote that JJ and Tylee were happy and busy in the spirit world and that she would see them again soon. Chad Daybell's trial began on April 1, 2024, nearly a full year after Lori's conviction. He faced trial for 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud in connection with the deaths of JJ, Tylee, and Tammy. On May 30, 2024, after weeks of testimony and evidence, Chad was convicted by a jury of first-degree murder of his wife Tammy Daybell and 2 counts of first-degree murder of Lori Vallow's children, Joshua JJ Vallow and Tylee Ryan. He was also convicted of 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder and 1 count of insurance fraud. On June 1, 2024, Chad Daybell was formally sentenced to death by lethal injection. He will spend years on death row in Idaho while his appeals are processed through the court system. After her sentencing in Idaho for the murders of her children and conspiracy to murder Tammy Daybell, Lori was extradited to Arizona to stand trial for the murder of Charles Vallow and the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. On December 7, 2023, Lori was arraigned in two separate Arizona cases. She was charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in the 2019 death of her fourth husband Charles Vallow and conspiracy to commit murder in the attempted killing of Brandon Boudreaux. The court entered pleas of not guilty for her on both charges. In an absolutely bizarre twist that shocked legal observers, Lori chose to represent herself at both Arizona trials despite having absolutely no legal training or experience whatsoever. This decision led to multiple strange and uncomfortable incidents with the court as Lori attempted to cross-examine witnesses, present her own defense, and make legal arguments. Her trial for conspiracy to murder Charles Vallow began on March 31, 2025. The Phoenix jury began deliberations on April 21. On April 22, 2025, the jury found Lori Vallow Daybell guilty of conspiracy to commit murder in Charles Vallow's death. She now faced another life sentence in Arizona. Lori was then immediately tried for the conspiracy to commit murder in the attempted killing of Brandon Boudreaux. On June 12, 2025, she was found guilty of conspiring to murder Brandon Boudreaux. On July 25, 2025, Lori was sentenced to life in prison on both murder conspiracy convictions in Arizona, marking an end to the criminal trial phase of this winding legal saga. She is currently serving multiple life sentences without possibility of parole in Idaho for the killings of her two youngest children and the conspiracy to kill Tammy Daybell. Both Chad and Lori have filed appeals of their convictions and sentencings. The web of victims in this case extends far beyond just Tylee, JJ, and Tammy, though they paid the ultimate price with their lives. Charles Vallow, shot dead by Alex Cox in July 2019, was a devoted man who loved his family fiercely and tried desperately to save his wife from her dangerous delusions. He filed for divorce citing specific threats to his life. He strategically changed his life insurance beneficiary to protect his sister. He tried to warn Tammy Daybell about the affair through that email. He expressed genuine fears for his life to police officers. And in the end, he was murdered in Lori's home while his stepdaughter Tylee watched helplessly. Brandon Boudreaux survived an assassination attempt, with a bullet missing his head by mere inches, forever shattering his sense of safety and security. Even Joseph Ryan, Lori's third husband and Tylee's biological father, who died in 2018 from what was officially ruled a heart attack, became the subject of an FBI investigation given Lori's recorded comments about wanting to kill him, like "Neff, I killed." The FBI ultimately found no evidence of foul play in Joseph's death, but the fact that they investigated shows the scope of suspicion surrounding this woman. Kay and Larry Woodcock fought tirelessly, relentlessly for justice for their beloved grandson JJ. Kay testified at Lori's trial, her voice breaking as she described the beautiful, special little boy they loved, the child Charles had adopted, the grandson they will never be able to hold again. When the guilty verdict was read in May 2023, the crowd of supporters outside the courthouse erupted in cheers and applause as Kay and Larry exited, finally seeing some measure of justice. But no guilty verdict can bring JJ back. No sentence can undo the horror of what happened to that innocent child. Colby Ryan, Lori's oldest child and the only one of her children who survived, has been living with absolutely unimaginable trauma. In October 2024, Colby revealed on his podcast that he had recently spoken with his mother on the phone from prison. Lori told him she had not murdered anyone, that she was on a divine mission from God, and that everything would eventually make sense when the truth came out. She is still, even now, sitting in prison for multiple murders, claiming complete innocence and maintaining that she was following God's plan. Colby has spoken publicly about how he struggles daily with the knowledge that his mother killed his siblings, that the woman who raised him is responsible for such incomprehensible evil. He's trying to build a life and raise his own children while carrying that trauma. Chad Daybell's 5 adult children have consistently maintained their father's innocence throughout this entire ordeal, with his daughter Emma Murray publicly saying she believes Chad was manipulated and framed by Alex Cox and Lori Vallow. In September 2021, Chad's children issued a joint public statement defending their father and claiming he had been fooled in the worst, most deadly way possible by Lori. They insist their father is innocent and that their mother Tammy died of natural causes. The property in rural Idaho where Tylee and JJ's bodies were found buried has since been demolished and cleared. What was once the site of unimaginable horror has been transformed, though the memory of what happened there can never be erased from that land or from this community. Even with guilty verdicts and life sentences imposed, even with all the evidence presented at multiple trials, there are still haunting questions about this case that may never be fully answered. How did two seemingly normal people convince each other that murdering children was not only acceptable but actually necessary and righteous? Was it truly religious delusion and mental illness, or was it something darker and more calculated? A convenient justification wrapped in religious language for eliminating anyone who stood in the way of their affair and their financial gain. Prosecutors consistently argued throughout the trials that while Chad and Lori wrapped all their crimes in elaborate religious language and theological justifications, the actual motives were ultimately about money and removing obstacles to their relationship. Charles's life insurance money, Tammy's $430,000 in life insurance, the children's ongoing Social Security benefits, Brandon Boudreaux's life insurance that they hoped to access through Melanie. All of it added up to significant financial gain, and every single person who died or was targeted was someone who could have exposed the affair, interfered with their plans, or prevented them from being together. But the religious beliefs were clearly real to Chad and Lori on some level, or at least they seemed to genuinely believe their own theology. They really did rate people on a light and dark scale with specific numerical scores. They really did perform elaborate casting ceremonies to try to remove evil spirits. They really did believe the world would end in July 2020 and that they would lead the survivors as gods. When that prophesied date came and went with no apocalypse, Chad and Lori were already in custody awaiting trial, but neither of them ever publicly acknowledged that their prophecy had catastrophically failed. They just moved on to other explanations. The psychological dynamics of this case are fascinating and disturbing to mental health experts who have studied it. Chad positioned himself as the prophet, the one who received visions directly from God and communicated with the spirit world. Lori was his goddess, his eternal companion across multiple lifetimes, but Chad was clearly the one who made the spiritual ratings, who determined who was light and who was dark, who held the ultimate religious authority in their twisted belief system. And Lori, who by all accounts from people who knew her had always been searching for meaning, for purpose, for someone to tell her she was special and chosen, found in Chad a man who told her she was literally a goddess destined to rule over the survivors of the apocalypse. That kind of validation and attention is intoxicating, especially when it comes wrapped in religious language that makes everything feel divinely ordained and righteous. But here's what makes this case so uniquely horrifying compared to other murder cases. They didn't just kill adults who they claimed were possessed or standing in their way. They killed children. Innocent children. Tylee was 16 years old, just starting to figure out who she was as a person, navigating the complicated social world of high school and adolescence. JJ was 7, a little boy with autism who needed extra patience and care, who loved his family and his routines. These weren't strangers or enemies. These were Lori's own children, kids she had given birth to and nursed and raised from infancy. How does a mother look at her own child and see a demon-possessed zombie that needs to be eliminated? Prosecutors argued that the zombie doctrine was essentially a spiritual death warrant. Once someone was officially labeled a zombie by Chad and Lori, once they decided that person's body was possessed by a dark spirit, that person needed to die to free them. And conveniently, almost suspiciously, everyone who was labeled a zombie was someone who stood directly in the way of Chad and Lori's relationship or their financial plans. Charles Vallow didn't believe in their apocalyptic visions and was actively trying to get Lori psychiatric help, so he became a zombie. Tammy Daybell was married to Chad and would never agree to a divorce based on her Mormon faith, so she became a zombie. Tylee was becoming increasingly difficult and questioning her mother's new beliefs, and she had been a direct witness to Charles's murder since she was present in the house that day, so she became a zombie. JJ required constant specialized care and attention that Lori no longer wanted to provide, and he would have been a major liability and burden when Lori and Chad fled to Hawaii, so he became a zombie. The system failed these children catastrophically in multiple ways. Charles Vallow tried desperately to get help. In January 2019, he had Lori involuntarily admitted to a mental health facility for evaluation, but she was released after just a few hours with no follow-up. He filed for divorce in February, citing her specific threats and her delusional claim that she was a translated being who couldn't be held accountable for her earthly actions. He changed his life insurance policy because he genuinely, rationally feared she would kill him for the money. He sent that warning email to Tammy Daybell trying to expose the affair, but nobody took sufficient action that could have prevented the nightmare that followed. The Chandler Police Department investigated Charles's death in July and accepted Alex Cox's self-defense claim without much scrutiny. When Kennedy Elementary School was told by Lori that JJ was being homeschooled, nobody followed up to verify or check on his welfare. When neighbors noticed JJ being left outside alone for extended periods, nobody called Child Protective Services. And here's something that haunts everyone who followed this case closely. The children's bodies were buried in Chad Daybell's backyard for 9 full months before anyone found them. 9 months of Kay and Larry Woodcock desperately searching and begging for answers, while JJ's body was decomposing in the ground just yards from Chad's house. In April 2024, years after Tylee and JJ's deaths, their extended family and friends finally gathered for a proper celebration of life ceremony at the Colonial Theater in Idaho Falls. Over 200 people attended in person, and thousands more watched the live stream online as the community came together to honor and remember 2 children who were taken far too soon. Larry Woodcock sat on stage next to a large framed photograph of JJ, tears streaming continuously down his weathered face as he shared precious memories of his grandson. "That's my little man," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "We are blessed to forever be known as Papa and Mama. I wish you all could have met JJ and known him and loved him as we loved him." Todd Trahan, JJ's biological father, who is currently incarcerated in Louisiana for unrelated charges, called into the memorial service unexpectedly and spoke about seeing his son for the last time in 2019. JJ had been drinking chocolate milk and Kool-Aid while eating popcorn. "No parent in this world can prepare themselves for the things that happen to you," Trahan said, his voice thick with barely controlled emotion. "I've asked God why he would let things like this happen. You have been a warrior since you were born, just 2 pounds, 8 ounces. The Spirit of God was with you and is with you even more now, watching over me." Zach Cox, Tylee's cousin, wrote a heartfelt 3-page letter that was read aloud at the service. He recalled watching television shows with Tylee late at night and going to Jack in the Box together for food. He remembered how Tylee fiercely protected JJ, how she truly embraced her role as big sister. "I still can't wrap my head around anything that has happened and why this happened to you and JJ," his letter said. "Not a day goes by that I don't think about what you would be doing if you were still alive and still here today." The memorial service included beautiful performances of Over the Rainbow, Tears in Heaven, Go rest high on that mountain, and Ave Maria. There wasn't a dry eye in that entire theater. Legal proceedings continue even now in February 2026, years after the actual murders. Chad Daybell filed a notice of appeal just days after being sentenced to death in June 2024. His attorney John Pryor is asking the Idaho Supreme Court to review the entire case, the verdict, and the death sentence. Pryor requested that a state appellate defense attorney be immediately appointed and that all trial transcripts and records be included in the appeal for review. Because Chad is incarcerated and indigent, he asked that all court fees be waived. The Idaho Supreme Court automatically reviews every single death penalty sentence handed down, completely separate from any appeal filed by the defendant himself. This entire appellate process will likely take many years, meaning Chad Daybell will remain on death row for a long time, possibly decades, before any execution could potentially take place. Lori's legal saga also continues. In October 2024, her defense attorney filed a motion for a full mental competency evaluation, known as a Rule 11 evaluation, in connection with her pending Arizona trials. Judge Justin Bereski granted the motion, and Lori's February trial date was vacated as her case moved to a commissioner's court for competency hearings. 2 qualified mental health experts were appointed to thoroughly examine and evaluate Lori's mental state. This wasn't the first time Lori's competency had been seriously questioned. Back in 2021, she had been deemed unfit to stand trial and was committed to a mental health facility for treatment, putting her Idaho murder trial on hold for months. She underwent intensive treatment and was eventually restored to competency, which allowed her Idaho trial to finally proceed. What makes Lori's competency evaluations so legally complex is that she has consistently refused to fully cooperate with mental health experts. She doesn't want to speak candidly to doctors. She doesn't want to answer detailed questions about her beliefs or her state of mind. The case forces us to confront genuinely uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil. Is Lori Vallow Daybell severely mentally ill, suffering from delusions that made her genuinely believe she was a goddess on a divine mission? Or is she simply an evil, calculating person who cynically used religious beliefs as a convenient justification for getting exactly what she wanted? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Lori likely has significant personality disorders that distort her thinking and allow her to lack normal empathy for others. But she also made cold, calculated choices. She planned carefully. She covered up evidence. She lied convincingly to investigators. She knew that what she was doing was illegal, which is precisely why she fled and why she and Chad tried so hard to hide the bodies. Mental illness may have contributed to her twisted worldview, but it doesn't absolve her of legal and moral responsibility for her actions. JJ Vallow loved his family deeply. He needed routine and structure because of his autism. He had a service dog that helped him navigate the confusing world. He was only 7 years old when his mother and her boyfriend decided he was possessed by a demon and needed to die. He was wrapped in plastic duct tape covering his little mouth and binding his small hands, and he suffocated alone in the terrifying dark. His last moments on this earth were pure terror and confusion, not understanding why this was happening, unable to call for help because tape sealed his mouth shut, unable to fight because his hands were bound. Tylee Ryan was 16. She was fiercely protective of her little brother JJ. She was just starting to figure out who she was and who she wanted to become as an adult. She had been present in the house when her stepfather Charles was shot and killed. She knew something was terribly wrong with her mother. And then one morning, after what should have been a fun family trip to Yellowstone, she disappeared forever. Her body was deliberately burned and dismembered and buried in a pet cemetery. She was reduced to charred bones and fragments in bags, so completely destroyed that the medical examiner couldn't even determine her specific cause of death. These were real children with real lives and real futures that were violently stolen from them. And the people who stole those futures, who brutally ended those young lives, were the very people who should have protected them most fiercely. Lori, their mother, and Chad, the man Lori chose over her own kids. If you've listened to this entire story, if you've made it through all the horrific details and the gut-wrenching testimony and the incomprehensible choices that led to multiple murders, then I hope you'll take a moment to remember Tylee and JJ not primarily as victims in a sensational true crime case, but as the real people they were. Remember JJ's infectious smile, his love for his family, the way he worked so hard every single day to navigate a world that was genuinely challenging for him. Remember Tylee's protective nature toward her brother, how she looked after JJ, how she was just starting her life with so much potential ahead of her. And remember Charles Vallow, who tried so hard to save everyone and died trying. Remember Tammy Daybell, whose quiet life of service and dedication to her family was ended violently by the husband she trusted completely. If this case has taught us anything at all, it's that we absolutely need to listen carefully when people tell us something is seriously wrong. Charles tried to warn everyone who would listen. He filed detailed police reports. He changed his life insurance beneficiary. He attempted to get Lori involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation, and nobody stopped what was coming. Kay and Larry raised the alarm about JJ being missing, but by the time authorities finally acted decisively, it was already far too late. The warning signs were there. The red flags were waving frantically, but the system failed these victims catastrophically. Hold your loved ones close tonight. Check on the children in your life. If you see something that doesn't seem right, speak up loudly. Don't assume someone else will handle it or that it's probably nothing. Don't talk yourself out of your instincts, because sometimes it's not nothing. Sometimes it's a child in genuine danger whose life could be saved if just one person takes action and refuses to look away. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for bearing witness to these victims' lives and their tragic deaths. And please, honor their memory by making absolutely sure that no other child suffers the same fate. Stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and never forget that behind every true crime story are real people whose lives matter deeply.